everybody. You're watching a Novartis Enterprise Architecture training session. We very much hope that you will enjoy the information we share and welcome any feedback you want to share with us. In this session, I will explain what the problem is which an enterprise architecture taxonomy addresses and why it is important for all of us to adopt a common EA language. Further, I will explain why we have created an EA taxonomy as well as which fundamental problems it solves. Last but not least, I will provide a high-level overview over the terms and concepts we defined, as well as shed a little more light at the approach we have taken in order to build Novartis EA taxonomy's first increment in a fit-for-purpose, comprehensive, orderly, and extensible fashion. Before we really start, let's look at a quite commonly quoted demarcation line between thinking and acting. We will look at a couple of statements, and I'm convinced that we all hear such considerations, reflections, and calls for action each and every other workday. Thus, we very much know them and use them ourselves quite often when we conduct discussions with our management as well as with peers. I believe that all the following statements, despite the fact that they sound fair, compact, and clear at first glance, share one common property all among them. They are less clear, less complete, less precise, even less relevant for Novartis if we start to, a little more seriously, put them onto a test bench. Okay, let us assume that we are entering a meeting room and we meet a colleague over there. The colleague is already waiting for us. We have a couple things to discuss conjointly, and the colleague obviously has his own opinion all around these different concepts and terms. Now we meet that person and start to have a conversation with him. Let us assume that the colleague here makes a couple of statements during that meeting. Do these types of statements sound somewhat familiar? They are fair in a sense, right? Let's just quickly glance at them and one after the other look with a little more critical distance at them. The first one says, let's stop the discussions and take bold decisions. We must be pragmatic. I ask myself here whether pragmatism and reflective thinking are really contradictory concepts. Let's assume that they are. Then wouldn't this mean that we had to always decide either or? That we would have to exclusively and always just either think or act? Let's look at the next statement. SSO is not rocket science. Thus get your act together and switch it on for application A. Well, again, critical distance. Even though, again, this seems to be a very sound statement, is it really like that? Is SSO, which stands for single sign-on, really that clear? So is it, for example, really one and the same thing for each and every one out there? I believe that there are colleagues who would explain SSO as, I'm not bothered with a login dialog anymore. For other colleagues it means, I can use a single login credential for all my applications rather than a separate key for each and every other application. Maybe another person asks herself the question, how can anyone single sign-on enable a single application? Well, all fair questions as well. Last but not least, and while SSO may be seen as an overly easy concept to grasp from an end-user perspective, it has as many flavors as applications, technologies, etc. exist from an SSO enabling and IT perspective. So while it certainly is not rocket science from an end-user point of view, it can be quite rocket science-ish from an IT viewpoint. As a last statement, we look at this one. Security is crucial for this application, therefore, all transmitted data must be encrypted in order to protect this app. Is encrypted transmittal of data really securing an application in all relevant regards? Or does encrypted data transmittal still include the possibility of attacks that are now just funneled through an encrypted channel but maybe lead to data leakage nevertheless? Think of code injection attacks, for example. They would very conveniently, and as are protected against introspection from the outside, travel over a highly secured motorway, so to speak, but fully bypass the means that were brought into place in order to secure the application presumably end-to-end. I hope that you see and agree with me that a lot of what we hear and state each and every other workday is not as clear, precise, commonly understood and agreed, etc., as it sounds and as it looks at first glance, and that in some, not very few, cases, the consequences of this conceptualization gap are severe, costly, effort-intense, risky, and may lead to an unnecessarily complex system landscape over time. So doesn't it make sense to be a little more precise, sometimes with regards to the presumably obvious? We believe yes. This is why we have made an effort to stand up the EA taxonomy here at Novartis, thus to establish a common conceptual and terminological ground for the architecture community. If we take a step back and look at the bigger picture and start from the top, then we can say that a corporate IT function is primarily engaged with reflection on the strengths, needs, deficiencies, and constraints of its respective IT platforms, with taking decisions on where and how their IT platforms need to evolve, as well as with conducting concrete steps to realize those taken decisions. All this requires an IT function to understand and reflect, explain and convince, compromise and agree. And this in turn is 100% on something that we can refer to as communication, be it one with herself or one with another. Where finally we can say that the fundamental vehicle of communication is language, be this a human language, a modeling language, a domain-specific language which copes with the needs to communicate between experts, e.g. physicians, an RFP-oriented language, and protocol, or simply the set of phrases, convictions, beliefs, traditions, and conditions that conjointly constitutes a corporation's or society's culture. The notion of language includes this language's semantics and meaning, which are the fundamental underpinning of any form of communication, as well as its profoundness, solidity, and its level of being shared and used in a non-ambiguous manner which finally determines its fitness for purpose and adequacy of the expressive potential it spans, ultimately everything that can be achieved based upon it. When we look at this for a second and reverse engineer the concept of language all the way up into what a corporate IT function's ultimate contributions are, then we see that getting this language wrong ripples up into what a corporate IT function is mainly engaged with. This means not more, nor does it mean less, than wrong language can cause severe damage in our day-to-day work life, where severe damage includes that needs and constraints are wrongly and mistakenly spotted, that wrong decisions are taken regarding our IT platform's further evolution, and that steps are inadequately taken in order to move our IT platforms to their next stage. So after having said all the above, the aim of Novartis EA taxonomy is to establish the fundamentals of our communication so that we further improve our conscious reflection on needs, our taking of right decisions over the wrong, as well as our performing of appropriate steps towards Novartis IT platform's next stage in a correct and adequate fashion. Let us now look at communication in a little more detail and explore two flavors of miscommunication as well as problematic consequences of mistakenly agreeing and mistakenly disagreeing. Before we actually do this, let's look at a concrete example quickly. Let's assume that Colin meets Linda and that he starts talking about Rita, who he met yesterday. In their conversation, Colin says to Linda, referring to Rita, "When I met her yesterday, I saw her duck." Ambiguity in our language, be this in statements like Colin's or in those concepts that are called by one single term like, for example, love, dignity, freedom, etc. So ambiguity in our language is omnipresent and opens up rooms for interpretation. In this example, Colin could have meant that 1. Rita ducked down when he saw her, or that he saw the duck of Rita, thus the duck that Rita owns. Ambiguity is manifold and does obviously not only concern a statement's sender, but also this statement's receiver, who in this case is Linda. So, very similar to Colin, Linda could have heard Colin's messages either Rita ducked down when Colin saw her, number 1, or that Colin saw the duck that Rita owns. Now, based on this configuration, we harvest two matches as well as two mismatches of Colin's and Linda's understanding, which could both possibly occur. Shared norms, values, traditions, and experience, of course, help to keep the probability for misinterpretation at a significantly lower level than the chances for Colin and Linda to interpret Colin's statements in exactly the same way. However, there is no guarantee in the sentence that Colin spoke to be read, heard, and taken in only one single way. Thus, chances for misunderstanding are certainly not zero either. What does it mean to mistakenly agreeing to something? Let's assume Colin makes a statement that allows for agreement, disagreement as such. For example, a soccer field has the shape of a square. Let's simplify this a little by using the letter A to represent Colin's statement. So Colin says A, and Linda confirms A. Let us now look at the conceptualization of A on Colin's side as well as on Linda's side. So while Colin's concept of A is a square, as we can see, the conceptualization of A on Linda's side ends up to be a triangle. So here we can nicely see how Colin and Linda mistakenly perceive A to be conceptualized in exactly the same way on both sides, while in fact they are not. Now let us look at the logic behind mistakenly disagreeing. Again, we assume that Colin started off a conversation saying A to Linda. This time, however, Linda disagrees and counter-proposes B as the right concept here. When we look at the conceptualization of A on Colin's side and the conceptualization of B on Linda's side, let's have a quick look at those. Then this time we realize that different statements, single terms, phrases, whatever, were used by Colin and Linda to point to the same concept in fact. So in other words, we see that Colin and Linda mistakenly perceive the conceptualization of A to clash with the one of B. This leads to disagreement on Linda's side, while actually Linda would have to agree. We hope that you have seen by now how important solid language and communication are indeed, in order to underpin our conscious reflection on needs, in order to avoid they are wrongly and mistakenly spotted, to enable our taking of right decisions over the wrong, in order to avoid that wrong decisions are taken regarding our IT platform's evolution, as well as to improve correctness and adequacy of the concrete steps we are taking from here. This slide provides you with an overview of one set of terms that we have defined from an architecture viewpoint in the meanwhile, as well as in the context of the EA taxonomy. As you can see, the terms on this slide are quite fundamental terms, and a lot of non-architecture disciplines refer to them as well. Also, all terms on this slide have been defined in the Novartis EA taxonomy context. While the terms that you saw so far in an overview fashion are in scope of the EA taxonomy workgroup, the more fundamental terms on the previous slide relate to the terms as stereotypes, or as terms that class taxa on the slide that you look at here. The term application or technology on this slide, for example, and among other key distinguishing factors that make these terms up, qualify both as computer systems. This relationship between different sets of terms, where one term in set A classes a whole group of terms in a set B, is known as a system of meta-languages. The language on slide number 6 constitutes the terminological basis for terms that we see here on slide number 7. This approach was very consciously taken in order to create an EA taxonomy framework that provides comprehensive orientation as well as allows for its scalable, controlled, and orderly evolution. Another aspect that you might have noticed is that on these overview slides, we have explicitly captured and stated relationships that exist all among the individual taxa and terms. This is, if you want, the second approach pillar that we consciously picked. To start defining terms in a broad and relative rather than absolute and deep-digging fashion focuses the edges of appropriate concepts, not their centers of gravity. This in turn incredibly accelerated the building of the EA taxonomy's first increment because we looked at those aspects that make terms distinct first. So this helped us to work around the otherwise unavoidable, stumbling from one deep dive definition to the other, recognizing that already the next term is clashing in many regards with the one we just finished off. We very much encourage you to dig deeper into the EA taxonomy and its respective terms definitions. Please go to Novartis Architecture community site, where we have very prominently placed a link to all EA tax terms definitions. We have created and will continue to maintain EA taxonomy terms inside Novapedia, the Novartis equivalent to the well-known Wikipedia universe. So you are able, as a Nova Wiki author, to help further evolve those definitions that we have already agreed, as well as to suggest further terms that you deem crucial for an architect. I hope you enjoyed this session and that I was able to stimulate your curiosity further. If during the session any question arose on your side, you can always reach out and discuss directly with me, from one architect to another. Please ping me anytime at ingo.arnold@novartis.com.